Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 166, May 20th to May 26th, 1864. Last week we talked about action in the Shenandoah Valley, essentially the opening of the 1864 campaign. Sigel and the Union Army in this region has been defeated at the Battle of New Market, but the campaign will renew sooner rather than later. This week, we will look at the other wing of the Union advance in Virginia. This one just as successful in the Bermuda 100 campaign. We also need to check back in with Grant and Lee as they maneuver in the central part of the state. Let's first, though, head out to the James River. Before we do that, though, we do need to talk about Patreon content, and of course, we do have an episode here in the month of May. This one's going to be a movie review, and we did The Field of Lost Shoes. That connects very well with our last episode here. That one would be the Battle of New Market, and obviously that movie depicts especially the VMI cadets and their action in that battle. So if that sounds like something that would interest you, us going over that, we've done some picture slideshows. We might go back to the well of picture slideshows here coming into June as we fight the Battle of Cold Harbor. It's one of my favorite battlefields, so we might go back to the picture slideshow. We've done memoir reviews as well. One episode where we did a statistical analysis. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link to the Patreon in the show description. And of course, those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. So much in the same way that we have had two generals who were kind of cast-offs in the valley, we should also point out that we have two more who have had a bumpy ride here in this region of Virginia. For the Confederates, eventually PGT Beauregard would come up from Carolina to take command, and George Pickett will also be present and involved in the action. We should not have to speak too much on the rocky ride Pickett has been having, and Beauregard has essentially been sidelined since the earlier stages of the war, mostly because of his feud with Jefferson Davis, which, spoiler alert, is not going to go away. For the Federal side, we have Benjamin Butler, who we really have not talked about maybe since Morton's Ford at the beginning of the year, that plan to move on Richmond failing. He would be given another opportunity, the North believing that Drury's and Chaffin's bluffs were the only real defenses if he was to move up the James. With a lighter defense, perhaps Butler could cause havoc in the rear while Lee was occupied with Grant. Certainly, it would hold down any reinforcements that could be moving his way. The campaign would eventually evolve to focus on Petersburg and the railroads there, but initially, this would be Butler's goal. He would have the 10th Corps under Quincy Gilmore. You remember Gilmore from his attempts on Charleston. Alfred Terry, who you remember from those campaigns, would command a division, as would John Turner and Adelbert Ames. You should remember Ames as having trained the 20th Maine, and Turner had served as the chief of staff for Gilmore. Baldy Smith would command the 18th Corps, his divisions under Bully Brooks, who we met at Salem Church, and Godfrey Weitzel, who has been with Butler for some time. John Martindale, who we met all the way back during the 7 days, will also hold a command, taking over at one point for Weitzel. John Hinks would have a division of United States colored troops, Hinks being a radical Republican who has risen through the ranks. Cavalry would be under August Kautz, and the naval contingent under Samuel Lee, the U.S. naval officer we have spoken before, who was a cousin of Robert E. Lee. He would have a handful of vessels, but really only 2 ironclads to contend with the 3 the rebels had in terms of a river defense fleet. Beauregard would eventually have brigades under William Walker and Eppa Hunton. You remember Hunton from previous campaigns. Robert Ransom would command a division with Archibald Gracie commanding a brigade, him having done good service at Chickamauga, if you recall. He would also have Barton's brigade, commanded by Seth Barton, and the officer who led them at Pickett's charge, Burkett Fry, as well as Kemper's brigade, commanded by William R. Terry. Hoke's brigade would be commanded by Colonel William Lewis, with Robert Hoke himself commanding a division. Hoke would have Montgomery Corse, Johnson Haygood, Thomas Clingham, and Bushrod Johnson commanding brigades. Haygood had fought at Fort Wagner and would go on to become governor of South Carolina. Clingham was a politician who had commanded a regiment and a brigade previously in the Eastern Theater. Alfred Colquitt would command another division with a brigade under Matt Ransom, the brother of the previously mentioned Ransom, and H.C. Whiting would add another division, who would also be taken over by D.H. Hill during the campaign, and Henry Wise, who we have not talked about in some time, taking a brigade while his son fights on the field at Newmarket as a VMI cadet. Overall, the Union Army did have some veteran outfits, but mostly the ranks were filled with immigrants who had been thrown into service. Despite some conscripts, the Confederates were able to put together a pretty decent fighting force with several capable officers. The only issue was, when you cobble together a force, as we have mentioned, and I'm sure I sound like a broken record now, and you probably, if you've been listening, you know exactly what I'm going to say, is that if you put together a lot of different units and a lot of different officers, despite the capabilities of those men in the ranks and the men who are leading them, if you don't have cohesion, then that's going to be a problem. If they're not used to working together, and you could probably say that about many different aspects, work teams, shall we say, as well, but obviously very much so on the battlefield in the 1860s. As April would see the preparations being made, the Confederate forces would be strung out. Beauregard, who was called upon by Lee to move up to Richmond, would have troops in North Carolina and Virginia. Robert Hoke, if you recall, is still operating against New Bern, while Pickett is taking over forces south of the capital. Bushrod Johnson, whose command was far afield in southwest Virginia, would be called upon to join the armies as Butler made some preparations of his own. You remember Bushrod Johnson having served during Chickamauga, and then following that battle, he's attached to Longstreet during the campaign against Knoxville, and of course, then his command kind of is lost. They can't get back to Bragg, so they end up being in southwest Virginia and eventually find their way to Richmond, so they've had quite the journey. Butler would send Colonel Guy Henry on a feint to the peninsula and the York River, making Jefferson Davis think he was in fact moving in that direction. He would achieve surprise on May 5th, successfully making several landings along the James River. One would be at Wilson's Wharf, where Fort Pocahontas would be established, Fort Powhatan, an older work, and City Point near Petersburg, all of which would fall into Union hands. Pickett would grow very concerned at the arrival of the Army of the James in the vicinity, and rightfully so. There was not a major concentration of troops yet, except 3 brigades, including Hunton and Gracie, who were in the capital. Only some 900 men lay at Petersburg, but they did include some of the Washington Artillery, an elite unit from the Army of Northern Virginia, who were still refitting and getting their horses fodder. Butler would claim that he would wish to push on to Richmond itself and capture the city, although this is probably a false claim he comes up with after the war. But as the main theater of the war is seeing large casualties in the wilderness, there would be another set of Union troops knocking on the back door, as it were. Beauregard would start to pull all the troops into motion, gathering several brigades from Carolina and sending them on to Pickett. Richmond could reinforce him in the meantime, Petersburg, oddly enough, being seen as expendable. I say that because, as we're going to find out, it's going to become a focal point of both armies, the defense of and the capture of, from both sides. So the fact that At this stage here in May of 1864 even, it's kind of seen as, well, we can give up Petersburg easy. That's very odd to think, especially as we get into the latter stages of the year and then 1865. If the Union forces were to capture Petersburg, there could be additional rebel troops coming up from the south. As it was, they were wedging themselves between that city and the capital, moving on to the Appomattox River, capturing Point of Rocks. Baldy Smith on the 7th would send out a reconnaissance to see about Petersburg. Charles Hickman would lead a brigade and engage some 600 men of Haygood's command at a place called Port Walthall. Outnumbering the rebels by more than twice their number, they would threaten the enemy position after some skirmishing, the 9th New Jersey coming very close to their line. Hickman, though, had orders for no general engagement, and so he would break off the combat. 68 Union casualties, compared to 35 for the Confederates, would mark the first action of the campaign. Now, something to be pointing out is Port Walthall would be along the railroad that connects Petersburg to Richmond, so they're kind of in between those two locations. If you look at a map, and hopefully I'll have one posted to the website, the Bermuda 100 area is kind of wedged in between them. That's where Butler is going to be operating. He's a little bit north of Petersburg and a little bit to the east, and then south, obviously, of Richmond. So he's right in between them, and that's a really dangerous spot for him to be. And another thing I'd like to point out is that Pickett during this time, some people have pointed out, and some of the sources that I've seen, that he actually turns in probably some of his best performances here. He's able to cobble together a very small force in these early engagements and really dissuade the Union Army, even though they have a lot more men, of actually accomplishing their goal, whether it's to capture Petersburg, cut the railroad line, or even try to make their way up north to Richmond. So he actually turns in a pretty good performance, especially following these disappointing kind of things that we have following Pickett's charge and then his action in the Carolinas. Bully Brooks, the next day, on the 7th, would lead a task force of a brigade from every division, 8,000 men, back to Port Walthall to try to drive the enemy. Now some 2,600 with Bushrod Johnson and the rest of Haygood's command joining in on the action. Skirmishing would start, delaying the Union forces for a time. But the assault would begin in earnest, the 8th Connecticut losing a good many casualties. A flank attempt would almost work, but the South Carolinians rallied and artillery would drive back the attackers. Additional force might have ended the rebel defense, but the uncoordinated units would inexplicably be called off, ending the Second Battle of Port Walthall with only additional Federal losses to show. Why exactly Butler had decided to make a cobbled-together command as opposed to just having a more cohesive unit attack the enemy was unknown. The majority of his army was busy digging in, and he potentially was wishing for more reinforcements from Washington. Although any reinforcement that's going to be coming from the north is going to go straight to Grant and the Army of the Potomac, obviously in an attempt to make sure that his numbers are staying on par while conducting the Overland campaign. What was clear was that it would not be a cakewalk into Richmond, Johnson now at Petersburg, and reinforcements filtering in. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, would be stymied. They would lose one ship to a torpedo explosion, killing a majority of the crew, and they would have to burn a second vessel as it approached Chaffin's Bluff and took on small arms fire from the Confederate defenders. Fort Clifton, a work that would protect Petersburg, would stubbornly hold on, despite naval and land pressure, forcing the disabling of one ship and the burning of the Thomas Brewster. The cavalry, meanwhile, under Kautz, would at least have mixed results. He would launch 2 raids, one very successful, which destroyed 2 railroad bridges and captured valuable supplies. His second raid, which was not as successful, was sent to try to eliminate railroads to the west, but Lafayette-McLaws had done a good job setting up a defense, the cavalry taking on several casualties before being forced to retire back to Butler at City Point. It's another thing that we get in these campaigns here, and especially as we get into the latter portion of the war, we're going to have like these kind of curtain calls for guys showing back up. Lafayette-McLaws obviously benched because he doesn't get along with James Longstreet, and obviously the Battle of Gettysburg is where that kind of rift starts, and then, of course, the Knoxville campaign as well. So now the question was whether to drive north or south. May 9th would see the answer in Baldy Smith leading a large force of men to Swift Creek, the line north of Petersburg, that was occupied by Johnson, falling back from Port Walthall Junction. More reinforcements had come in, making the force some 4,600, dug in with strong artillery. Braxton Bragg, in conjuncture with a move in the north at Chester Station, would have wished Johnson to attack if he ran into the enemy, but switched the order to a reconnaissance in force. South Carolinians would run into Baldy Smith as he moved down, causing a sharp fight. Out of their earthworks, some of the Palmetto Staters were scattered, while others orderly withdrew. Something else that we need to talk about as we get into Petersburg and as we fight the Overland campaign is that once soldiers dig in on a particular field, getting them to get out of those earthworks and then having them act as infantry in the field is going to be tough because they're safe. They're going to have that psychological aspect of feeling safe behind earthworks. And then if you're having them move out after having already dug them and then attack the enemy, they're not going to be as effective. Smith, in the meantime, would be certain that he could not carry the works, despite having a large advantage with 10,000 men or so. Both sides would suffer several hundred casualties in the sharp fighting. Smith and Gilmore would be united in their disdain for Butler, their forces withdrawing back to City Point on the 10th with little to show. Butler had wished for a frontal attack, and maybe this would have worked, but the two officers had submitted an alternative plan, causing a rift. May 10th would see action at Chester Station, part of Alfred Terry's men being attacked by Eppa Hunton's brigade and Archibald Gracie. Hunton was tasked with a frontal assault while Gracie flanked the position. His 9th and 38th Virginia would be repulsed as more Union reinforcements strengthened their line, this including the veteran 7th New Hampshire and 6th and 7th Connecticut. Well-placed artillery had delivered canister and solid shot at the attacking foe. Gracie, although in a good position to flank, was recalled, the battle ending with over 200 casualties on both sides. Barton would be blamed and removed for Burkett Fry as a result. Both sides would continue to posture. Smith would launch a reconnaissance toward Proctor's Creek and the outer defenses of Drury's Bluff. Beauregard, meanwhile, swung Hoke around to be in position with H.C. Whiting's command, protecting Petersburg. During this time, you have to feel for Beauregard. Some units were dispatched to deal with Sheridan and his threat to the north, which we talked about during the Spotsylvania episode. Meanwhile, Kautz had launched his second raid, so that was going to be a problem. All in all, he wished to attack, actually giving the idea of pulling some troops from Lee, smashing Butler, then returning to join Lee and finish Grant off. A compelling idea, one that probably would not have worked. Still, Smith and Gilmore were exposed. They had driven in their outer defenses of Fort Darling and Drury's Bluff, but they could potentially be hit with a frontal assault or even flanked. With many gathered regiments under Pickett, Hoke, and Ransom, the odds seemed to be good for a general attack. One thing that we can talk about with Beauregard in this situation is that he's not going to be a timid officer. He is going to want to press the advantage where he sees one. He's going to want to attack. So he wants to capture some of that battlefield glory that he had in the early part of the war, kind of build back on his name, and he wants to do it kind of by himself. So obviously that's going to be a problem when you have Robert E. Lee, the premier battlefield leader for the Confederacy here in the region, but he's going to want to try to make sure that he gets some glory, and obviously that's going to bump heads with Lee. Under heavy fog, Beauregard would launch his assault on the 16th with the majority of the command, while H.C. Whiting, who had been aggressive earlier in the war, would hit Butler in the rear and cut off his retreat. Gracie and Terry's regiments would flank Weitzel and rout Heckman's command, that officer being captured. Despite this initial success, they would lose cohesion and loot the Federal camps. Hoke would press in the center, but Smith, along his line, had strung telegraph wire as a kind of hindrance for any attack, causing much confusion and breaking the charge. Still, the 63rd Tennessee would capture Federal guns, losing over 100 in the attempt. The Washington artillery would also suffer casualties, but overall be superior on the field. Further, on the Union left wing, Montgomery Corse would be wounded, his men attacking ineffectually. The 7th Connecticut would do hot work here, armed with Spencer repeating rifles. Smith would order his divisions to withdraw, despite their holding the line in this sector. It would be said, too, that the flank had been stabilized with the reserves. Still, the Union forces fell back, the 39th Illinois holding on in a rearguard action that saw a third of their forces become casualties. Beauregard would pause, with Butler gathering around his headquarters called Halfway House on the Richmond Turnpike. Whiting would lose his cool at Port Walthall, meanwhile, and there would be no third battle there, Albert Ames holding on to the Federal ground. This would allow the Union forces to successfully fall back to Bermuda 100. 3,000 rebels had become casualties compared to 3,600 to 4,000 Union troops, making this quite the sharp engagement. Now, it's quite possible you have not heard of the battle for Proctor's Creek, or also the battles around Drury's Bluff, perhaps is another name for them here. But if we look at these casualty figures, I have seen it pointed out in some of my sources that this battle actually was greater in terms of loss of life than, say, Perryville. And we often see a little bit more reference to Perryville in our histories of the Civil War. So obviously this was a pretty big engagement, even though we're seeing these monstrous losses in the Overland campaign, these large battles. And that's part of the reason why it gets overshadowed. But still a pretty significant battle here south of Richmond and a little bit north of Petersburg. Lack of cohesion on both sides would spell failure. But the Confederates would enjoy their victory, capturing much in terms of Union supply. Beauregard would wish to press the attack, but Lee was in need of reinforcements, so Pickett would be sent to him with additional brigades. He also thought of an idea to hit Grant in the rear, which Davis also shot down. The Confederate president had wanted the Creole to add Whiting into the attack and not leave him at Port Walthall, so their feud would continue. It's actually a fair point, is that if you have Whiting actually in your line at Proctor's Creek there, instead of operating in the rear of the army, you obviously, Adelbert Ames and his command has to check any kind of advance from that particular area. But if you have everybody together, then maybe you would have been able to throw in additional reinforcements and actually really press your attack and could have seen some additional success. Beauregard would try to press his advantage at Ware Bottom Church on the 20th. If anything, he wanted to get a better position on Butler. The attacks would drive off the Union outer defense, but they would not gain anything further, stopped by the Federals. Counterattacks might have dislodged the attackers, but in confused fighting that caused over 1,000 casualties on both sides, Beauregard had accomplished a key goal. His defenses would soon be able to bottle Butler in, and the victory allowed him to shift Pickett to Lee in time for the Battle of Cold Harbor. Both sides would dig in, seeing brief skirmishing. This included Fitzhugh Lee attacking Wilson's Wharf and Fort Pocahontas, which was defended by the 1st and 10th United States Colored Troops. With the help from a gunboat and reinforcements, the defenders, at the cost of only 22 casualties, would inflict 200 on the rebel troopers and successfully defend the fort. This success would not be enough to save Butler, who was soon going to be replaced along with Gilmore. Overall, the campaign had been a missed opportunity for the Federals, and a good effort by Beauregard, who often does not get a whole lot of credit, even if giving Pickett and Hoke up so that they can join Lee was a key part of his contribution. Butler failed, as did Baldy Smith and Quincy Gilmore. If they had held Beauregard's attention by performing better at Drury's Bluff and Ware Bottom Church, then it may have been possible for Grant to win at Cold Harbor. As it was, we'll have to wait until next week to see how that battle turns out. Speaking of Grant and Lee, let us leave the overshadowed Bermuda 100 campaign and take a look at what goes on the road to Cold Harbor. So when we last left off with the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Potomac, we had a stalemate at Spotsylvania. Grant was going to want to flank Lee out of his earthworks, but the question was exactly how to do that. If you could get him in the open field and destroy his army, that would be preferable. To accomplish this, he would launch Hancock on a long flanking maneuver, eventually following the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad all the way down through Bowling Green, eventually arriving at Milford Station, a little south of Guinea Station. You remember where Jackson had died of his wounds. The slower march was supposed to be a good target for Lee, who would strike at the 2nd Corps, and in so doing would open himself up to Warren and the 5th Corps, who could move down the Telegraph Road. But Ewell had set himself up blocking Warren at Mud Tavern, and Lee did not take the bait for Hancock. If the goal had been to gain the North Anna River first, ironically, Hancock had set himself up in a good spot for that. But his corps was still depleted, and he ran into something he did not expect at Milford Station, that being Confederate infantry. His cavalry escort, really the only mounted men available, in Torbert, would make contact with Terry's Confederates as they moved north to reinforce Lee after the action in the Bermuda 100 campaign. After a brief fight, which included part of the rebel force staying in their earthworks by mistake and having to be swarmed by the Union troops, Hancock would pause. With Terry and corps nearby, as well as Confederate cavalry, combined with Hancock being a little less than aggressive, understandable since the mule shoe, this would mean that the Federal advance would halt. Grant would shift Warren to follow Hancock's route, switching up his tactics. Lee, in the meantime, would realize that he would need to withdraw in the face of the rest of the Union Army, making it, for real, a race to the North Anna. Ewell had done a good job in securing the Telegraph Road, a direct route back toward the North Anna and Hanover Junction. May 21st would see the army moving out, Ewell leading with Anderson and A.P. Hill taking an alternative route. Hill was back in command while Lee started to fall ill, which will affect the action forthcoming. His spirits would have to be helped by the addition of reinforcements. Breckinridge from the valley and more troops south of Richmond, fresh off their defeat at Butler at Drury's Bluff, would mean 13,000 additional troops, bringing his total back up to 53,000. Grant was bringing still some 68,000 to the field, him having been reinforced with 17,000 replacements, mostly heavy artillery units. This is definitely a testament to just the high casualties he sustained during these battles. But he would not have Sheridan and the cavalry, as they had become detached, remember after Yellow Tavern, moving back toward Butler. The rest of the Union Army would follow in the direction of Hancock, Warren actually probably having an opportunity to maybe hit Anderson as he marched south on the Telegraph Road, but not taking advantage. Warren, of course, is probably not the right guy for that job, but also the heavy campaigning was taking a toll on everyone. You see, I've seen it in several of sources how when Hancock kind of pauses, say at Milford Station, then he kind of gets a pass. Whereas when Warren, in this situation, doesn't hit the Confederate Army, it's considered to be a missed opportunity. And I kind of reflected that a little bit in my writing, just based off of some of the source material. But it is kind of a double standard. Grant does not like Warren. Meade is kind of getting fed up with Warren, even though he had him pretty high on the list of folks following Gettysburg. And to be fair, Warren was a pretty hot commodity. In fact, when Grant wants to potentially replace the commander of the Army of the Potomac, Warren is on the short list for that. So obviously he has kind of slid in terms of popularity, especially amongst these general officers. Lee would be able to win the race, eventually arriving at the North Anna ahead of his foe. But once there, he would misunderstand the intention of the enemy. He would believe in additional marching for Union forces, maybe trying to flank him further east. As the Army of Northern Virginia rested briefly at North Anna, John Hennigan would put Kershaw's old brigade into a redoubt north of the river at the Chesterfield Bridge crossing. His men would watch on the 23rd as Union cavalry skirmished with Torbert's advanced elements. Lee believed this to be a feint and initially was unconcerned, but he was mistaken. When a cannonball hit the chimney of his headquarters, he would realize the error. Hancock and the entire 2nd Corps had arrived at the Chesterfield Bridge. Further upstream would be Oxford, which was assigned to Burnside, and Jericho Mills, which was further assigned to Warren. Birney's division would be assigned to assault the work. Hennigan's small force would be overlapped by the divisions advancing. Gibbon and Barlow were a little east, with Robert Tyler and the heavy artillery units in reserve. Gershom Mott and Hobart Ward's old brigade, commanded by Thomas Egan, as well as Brewster, would assault the position. The South Carolinians would briefly stand before being forced to withdraw. A Confederate attempt to burn the bridge would fail, Hancock making sure the crossing remained intact. While Hancock saw success, Warren would bumble into another potential failure. His corps had seen only scant cavalry resistance at the ford at Jericho Mills and had thus brushed it aside. The divisions would start to deploy on a plateau once having gained the south bank. Crawford would form on the left with Griffin in the center. Cutler and his division would move to fill a gap in the line by taking over the right flank. Cadmus Wilcox, on the other hand, for the Confederates, would try to make sure that didn't happen. Rooney Lee had reported to him that only Federal cavalry had crossed the river, and thus he could dispense with them easily. Kind of suspect from Rooney, who also gave the faulty intelligence to his dad about Grant withdrawing before the Muleshoe, but Wilcox will deploy his division. Lane, McGowan's brigade commanded by Joseph Brown, Edward Thomas's brigade, and Scales's brigade commanded by Lawrence would align themselves right to left and launch at the entire 5th Corps. Lane's North Carolinians would see some trouble, being forced back and forced to redeploy. Despite Crawford, who had really been in our story since Sumter, losing his cool and fleeing from the field. Bragg's Bucktails and the Iron Brigade would also be smashed by Lawrence and Thomas in the meantime, both brigades not yet being deployed. For all the good performances the Black Hats had throughout the war, the Overland campaign was a tough go for them. Schweitzer would have to refuse his line to meet Thomas, who had a clear path to push the reserves into the river and cut Warren off almost entirely. Captain Charles Mink had set up artillery, and Joseph Bartlett, however, would launch his brigade and devastate the flank of the Georgians as they passed Schweitzer. Wilcox's division would thus be repulsed in the nick of time. Warren had avoided a major disaster. Wilcox might have benefited from reinforcements from Hill, but Hill had sent none, and thus a real opportunity to hamper the Army of the Potomac was lost. You do not really see destruction of armies during the Civil War, as we have previously mentioned, but another division from Hill and at least a corps might have been lost, making North Anna one of the more known engagements of the Overland campaign, instead of, at least I think, probably the least well known. Indeed, Lee had realized this importance, asking Hill, "Why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you attack as Jackson would have done?" This must have been hard to hear for Hill, who had thought he was acting, say like Jackson, at Bristow Station, which had earned him criticism. Without Lee in good health, though, I think it highlights the limitations of Hill and Ewell, who, to be fair, Lee had already kind of decided was going to be benched soon. Obviously, Hill had this personal rivalry with Jackson as well. They didn't get along, so obviously hearing him compared to Jackson, especially in this kind of way, obviously would have hurt his ego. And it just kind of shows Lee's frustration. He's limited, having to ride around in a carriage because he's so ill, and obviously he's not able to supervise these officers as he had done at the Wilderness to great effect. So he is a little bit frustrated. So the action on the 23rd would come to a close. Both sides were going to have to decide what to do from here. Lee decided to form his army into inverted V rather than retreat. The tip of the V would be at Ox Ford. Now, I know what you may be thinking. An inverted V did not work so well at Spotsylvania, but at Ox Ford it would be covered by sitting on a high bluff, and if you've ever been there, you really get that feeling because it's pretty high up. The wings of the V with Hill on the left would watch the approach from Jericho Mills, and the right with Ewell would protect Hanover Junction, as well as watch approaches from Chesterfield Bridge. Lee would wish for Grant to believe he was retreating, and thus be in a position to wedge himself in between wings of his opposing army. Sheridan, having rejoined Grant, would be a positive, and Burnside would be assigned to the Army of the Potomac, so no more independent command. Why Grant did not think of doing that earlier, I'm not exactly sure, but certainly it would make things a bit more organized. May 24th would see Burnside probe at Ox Ford, with Hancock deploying on the south side of the river across Chesterfield Bridge. Artillery from the strong Confederate works would open up on the Federals, and despite some skirmishing, the Second Corps would not attack. Martin Smith, who we've mentioned before, having designed the defenses at Vicksburg, had set up another good one. The Federals would have to assault over open ground two strong positions with artillery. Likewise, Burnside was stymied at Ox Ford. James Ledlie from Thomas Crittenden's division would be sent a little further upstream to another ford. Ledlie, who would be very drunk, and that's actually a theme that's going to follow him as we continue into the Petersburg campaign, well, he's going to be intoxicated, as with some of his staff. Despite Crittenden's warning and the weather turning into a storm, his brigade would launch an attack at the V, where Billy Mahone's men were stationed. The result was a tremendous slaughter. Mahone would throw some regiments in a counterattack, driving back the Union troops. Stephen Weld of the 56th Massachusetts and Stephen Chandler of the 57th would attempt to rally the Federals, but Weld would be wounded and Chandler mortally so. Mahone would send Chandler's effects back to the Union lines under a flag of truce. The brief action showed that the position was indeed quite strong. Lee was too ill to try a counter, and really this was the most important part of this action as opposed to Ledlie's attack. He had the Federals in a position where the wings could not support each other easily. He had interior lines. If he chose to attack, then it might have put Grant in an awkward spot. Breckinridge and Pickett were in reserve, and Anderson and Ewell were both relatively fresh, although Ewell would have to be replaced due to illness, Early taking his place. A stalemate on the 25th would offer some pause in the action. Grant, though, was convinced that because of a lack of a counterattack, then he really had Lee where he wanted him. This would lead him to continue his drive on Richmond, and ultimately, even greater slaughter at Cold Harbor. I think it is kind of interesting how Grant points out how Lee might have counterattacked him, and he's sort of pointing out a flaw in his own plans and how the army is laid out, in that if one side of the V, whether it's the Second Corps having made it across the river, if they're counterattacked and pushed back into the North Anna, or even the Ninth Corps or Warren for that matter, since they are both separated, if either of them are targeted, then obviously the North Anna once again becomes more of a significant battle during the Overland campaign. However, this opportunity is just not taken up by Lee. Now, part of that is his illness. Part of that is the fact that there is some pretty hard campaigning that the Army has undergone, and obviously there are replacements coming in. And we just mentioned earlier in the episode how replacements don't necessarily work together with veteran troops if there is not cohesion. So obviously there's a lot of factors that are going against even a healthy Lee, but Grant is going to take the fact that he made this mistake here, right? And that's something that gets pointed out in a couple sources, is that North Anna was a huge mistake by Grant, and it just is not capitalized by Lee. A lot of times you get pointed out that there's not enough manpower for him, but he does have his army back relatively fairly close to where he was before. So obviously there's a lot of factors, as I mentioned, that go into Lee not taking any kind of advantage in North Anna. And so we'll bring this week's episode to a close. This week, we covered events of the Bermuda 100 campaign. The left wing of the three-pronged attack by Grant will grind to a halt and come to nothing. Lee has retreated to the North Anna, and really left one of his last great opportunities on the table. The action on the main stage will continue next week. We will get into and then fight the Battle of Cold Harbor. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post it in the description. Should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback is always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening and have a great week.